All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. Just about 3 minutes until it's 2:30, but good to see you guys, and hope you're doing well this week. Just hang in there for a few moments, and we'll be ready to go. Hey Tina and hi Alicia, good to see you guys. Alan, Sylvia, welcome back. Hey Angela, Derek, Nicholas. Hey Spencer, Angelina, good to see you guys too. Hey Ismail, Ruby. Hope you're all doing good. Hey River, Sarah. Hey Catherine. Okay, just another minute pretty much. Hey Ashley and Diego and Gabby, Jasmine. Always good to see you guys, so welcome back. Emily. Hey there, Carson. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, well, next semester, Gabby, what I've heard is that we're all going to be on campus because it's going to be, everyone has to be vaccinated. So yes, I expect that I'll be assigned a couple classrooms. I mean, I'm teaching 4 classes in fall, yeah. So I'm teaching Intro to Philosophy, Critical Thinking, and then Philosophy 320, which is Contemporary Moral Issues. And as far as I know, everything's going to be in person, face-to-face for the fall. At least that's the last report that I've heard from the school. But anyway, hey guys, welcome back. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here as usual. So we basically are just going to continue to go through the notes in the order that we see in our syllabus. Today I'm going to try to go over the whole essay by Jjc Smart, which is called, oh, well, Jasmine, no, I am a professor for critical thinking. Basically, the name is just listed as staff until later in the summer when they edit the faculty information. But I already know I have 4 classes for the fall, and 2 of them are Philosophy 320, 1 is Philosophy 105, and 1 is Philosophy 100. So if anybody's interested in which specific sections that I teach in the fall, you can email me and I can let you know which ones they are. In the class schedule online, names of certain faculty members are not included, but we have been assigned classes. But yes, to just go back into our notes, we're trying to finish up and get further in the philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind is all about consciousness and perception and the ability to think and perceive anything at all. The reason that me and you are different from like this marker, because we're conscious beings that have consciousness, and this is just an inanimate object that cannot think, feel, or perceive anything. The questions could be raised. Is consciousness just a physical process having to do with the physical brain, or is there something non-physical about consciousness? Is the consciousness that you have more than just your brain, because maybe you have a soul that could survive the entire annihilation of the body and brain? Well, different views exist. Some people are monists, some people are dualists. Monism says that everything in the universe is made out of one kind of substance, and dualism says that everything in the universe is made out of 2 kinds of substances. The substances that are being discussed on either side are physical matter and mind. Physical matter is just anything that's extended in space, and the most primary unit of that would be the atom. And mind, in the philosophical sense, is like a non-physical consciousness. So something that has no extension in space, but yet has consciousness and thought, sort of like the idea of a soul. Now, dualism says that mind and body are both the substances that exist and that compose all things. And to a physicalist monist, everything's made out of matter, and even consciousness and thought is just made out of atoms, and therefore it's all physical. So we've looked at arguments for both sides of this debate. The argument for dualism was given by René Descartes, the famous French philosopher who wrote the Meditations. His argument basically said that because you can clearly imagine your mind and your body existing separately, since you can imagine yourself thinking even if you had no body, the two things must be distinct. They must be two different things. And the reason he thinks that is because God, he believes, he can prove to exist. And if God is perfectly good, then that means that whatever is a clear and distinct perception has to be true, because God will not deceive us. And since it's clear and distinct that when you can imagine two things existing separately, they really are two separate things, he thinks that's sufficient proof then that the mind and the body are separate because we can clearly imagine them existing separately. I believe I gave the example of me and this watch. Although you can see it's on my wrist, it's easy to imagine me and the watch being separated. And since you can clearly conceive of that possibility, that means me and the watch are not the same thing. And so in the same way, he says, you can clearly imagine your mind and your body existing without each other. And therefore, they must not be the same thing either. And then he also talked about how it's also clear and distinct that the external world exists and that you have a body. And that pretty much wraps up that argument for dualism from Descartes based on conceivability. Then last meeting, it was all about Daniel Stoljar and his discussion of physicalism. So he begins his paper by just saying what physicalism is. It's the view that everything is physical. And he says there's two questions that we have to deal with to fully understand this. The first is the interpretation question, which asks, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? And a separate related question is the truth question, which asks, is it true that everything is physical? So to tackle that first interpretation question, which by the way, he says you kind of have to deal with first before you can answer the other one, he says we should use the notion of what's called supervenience. So supervenience is a concept that applies to any large-scale structure that's made out of a bunch of little component elements. And in a dot matrix image, for example, you have a big picture that's made out of a bunch of little dots that are applied to a grid, and the dots being in the distribution and order and with the coloration that they each have displays the whole image. We can also use the other example of like a digital image, which is made out of pixels on a digital viewing device like your own screen right here. Now, in such a case of a dot matrix or pixelated image, what we call global features are just any large-scale aspects of the composite. So if you had I don't know, a picture of president signing a bill in the Oval Office with the U.S. flag behind him, then one of the global features of the image would be the flag. Another global feature of the image would be like the pen that he's holding, or the president himself. The idea of supervenience says that all the global features of such a composite are nothing other than the distribution of parts that make the whole structure. So that implies that if you had two separate dot matrices with the same exact positioning of parts or dots, then they would have to have all the same global features. Not to worry, good to see you, Isaac. And also, if you had two different dot matrices which had different global features, then they must have differences in the array of dots that make up those two images. So as applied to the physical universe, the claim is this. Our universe is a big composite structure, which is also made out of a bunch of tiny little elements. But in the case of the physical universe, these little physical components are atoms. And so, like the dot matrix or pixelated image, all the global features of the universe are made out of the little atoms. So much so that if we had a second duplicate universe, which was a physical copy of ours, atom for atom, a copy, then it would have to have all the same global features as our universe, including all aspects of consciousness. And so that's the really essential key point, that whatever you're thinking, feeling, perceiving in your mind would be completely replicated in a second closed physical system where all the atoms were distributed in the same exact way. And that makes it seem as though consciousness is nothing other than the physical distribution of atoms that gives rise to it. Because again, if by hypothesis a second universe was atomically arranged the same way, then consciousness would not be different. So it's totally supervenient upon and determined by the physical distribution of atoms. After that, he gave two arguments that physicalism is true. One was the argument from causal closure. The other was the argument from methodological naturalism. The causal closure argument basically said that every event only has one cause, not two, not zero, but exactly one. And since that is true, and because every event that has a cause has a physical cause, that means that when your mind causes your body to do something, like you make a decision, like to clap your hand or to speak, the action that we observe of you doing that thing is caused by the brain, the physical brain. The exclusion principle, the third premise, says that it cannot be both the physical brain but also the soul that are jointly causing the behavior, but it's just the physical brain. And since we know that's one cause, it's the only cause. To add another would be to adding an extra cause beyond what's needed. The other argument was the argument from methodological naturalism. And that one just says that it's reasonable to believe whatever a scientific community does, and they believe in physicalism, so that would be reasonable for you to believe too. Okay, so that was just my opening, typical process of trying to recap the last meeting so that it's all clear again in your mind. Get a good summary going. But now we're going to move to the next author on the same subject, and this is Jjc Smart. Okay, Jjc Smart, he is a Scottish-born philosopher who spent a lot of his career working in Australia. He was born in 1920, and he died in 2012. This is a paper that he wrote back in 1959, and it's called Sensations and Brain Processes. Sensations and Brain Processes, Jjc Smart, 1959. You know, philosophy in a way is kind of like a small world, and I actually have like a couple degrees of separation from Jjc Smart because I did a book, published a book back in 2014 that I co-edited, and I wrote one of the chapters. And I was working with a colleague who's another philosopher, but she's a couple generations older than me. She's up in her 70s. And she's a very well-known philosopher of Indian philosophy and religion. Anyway, when she was a grad student way back in the day, Jjc Smart was one of the advisors on her dissertation. So I guess due to our connection, I have a distant connection to him. And now I guess since you have a connection to me, you're 1 degree extra removed from Jjc Smart. But yeah, he's an interesting philosopher. He's worked on a range of topics, ethics, and also philosophy of science, which this paper is basically about. Okay, so let's see what he thinks. Jjc Smart, to first of all tell you, he's a physicalist. So he's another person who thinks that everything is made out of matter, and that even consciousness and perception and thought is also just the brain, the physical brain. So to him, there's no such thing as a non-physical consciousness. There's no soul or spirit or ghost. There's just the brain, the physical brain. And in his paper, he's defending a pretty straightforward thesis. His thesis is like an identity statement, and this is what it is. It's the statement that sensations equals brain processes. So this is his major claim that he's trying to, defend in the paper. So yeah, sensations are equivalent to brain processes. First of all, though, let me tell you what the word sensation means in his usage. Okay, this is a bit of a peculiar usage to his writing. So as he's using the word, sensations are just any state of consciousness whatsoever. Sensations, any state of consciousness. So here, I'll give you some examples. But you're familiar with all of these because you're a conscious being yourself. So any state that your mind can be in is a sensation according to his terminology. So How about the sensation of eating ice cream and the way it tastes? That's a particular state of consciousness. How about the sensation of attending a philosophy lecture and listening to the notes and taking notes? That's another state of consciousness. You're in that current state right now. Or the state of consciousness of delivering a lecture as a professor. That's my current state. Or the state of consciousness of having a memory. Go back in your mind right now. Think of your last birthday. That's a different state of consciousness. Or how about pain? You know, you knock your elbow on something and it hurts. You leave a bruise behind. That's another state of consciousness. Pain, pleasure, memories, anxieties, hopes, fears, terror, euphoria, whatever it may be. Riding a bike, playing a musical instrument, listening to music, watching a movie. All of these things across the board in infinite variety that we could describe, and many of these things that you've experienced yourself, they're different states of consciousness. Driving a car, playing a video game, whatever the case may be. What it's like to be experiencing that is the sensation, the state of consciousness that you're in. So now, returning to his major claim. His claim then is that all these states of consciousness in their diverse variety, what they all are ultimately is just brain processes. So what is it to taste that delicious ice cream? Well, according to his argument, all that is for your brain to be in a particular neural configuration at that time. So if we could take like a freeze frame, a snapshot of the state of the brain when you're experiencing that pleasurable ice cream taste, the claim is that the taste and the experience just is that brain process. So all your sensations are just physical states and configurations of your neural network in the brain. And that means that consciousness is just physical, because the electrochemical neurological functioning of the brain is a physical thing. So as he sees it, all of our conscious states are just brain processes, and that's why he thinks physicalism is true. Because if your sensations and your mental life are just physical brain states, then there's really nothing that's not physical. Because the only thing anybody thought was not physical was consciousness. And so if that's physical too, then physicalism rules the day and wins. Why is it that he wants to make such a strong case for physicalism? Why is he so interested in persuading us that sensations equal brain processes? Well, one of the reasons that he says at the beginning is this. Because if they were not brain processes, if dualism was true, for example, and consciousness and sensations are something that reside in the soul, and it's not necessarily anything that's absolutely connected to your physical brain or body, if that's what consciousness is, like a non-physical mind, then he says it would be something totally mysterious that science could never explain. And he brings in a piece of terminology right now, so let me add that to the board. The term that he refers to now is what is called nomological dangler. Okay. Nomological dangler. So what does this complicated looking word mean? Well, all it really means is just something that remains unexplained by the physical sciences. Okay, so nomological. The word derives from Greek. Nomos from Greek means of or pertaining to law. So nomological dangler, you should think of in your mind, if you can, if there was like a sphere of human scientific knowledge, which contains all of our collected scientific knowledge, but a nomological dangler would be like a random thing floating outside of that sphere that we don't yet know how to explain. So we've got all this scientific knowledge and understanding, but then there are these random things outside of there dangling free that we have not yet been able to bring within this self-contained sphere of human scientific understanding. So nomological danglers would represent unsolved mysteries that science has not yet been able to clearly explain how they work or what they are. So I've got a question, just going off common sense. Do you think that the scientific community prefers for there to be nomological danglers? Or do you think they would rather prefer to give scientific explanations for things and that there are no such things as nomological danglers? In other words, do you think that scientists like the concept of a nomological dangler or don't like it? What do you think about that? Would they rather concede that there are some things science will not explain? Or would they rather have the view that we could get a scientific explanation of all the things? What do you believe? Scientists like these nomological danglers, so-called, or not? Yeah, they don't like it. That's right, they do not. Because think about what it represents. A nomological dangler would be like a failure of science to explain something. It would be a gap in our, scientific knowledge and analysis. And scientists have the ambition, at least, even if it's not fully yet achieved. The goal and the ambition is to eventually explain all aspects of reality scientifically, not just most of them. So a scientist doesn't want to say, okay, well, let's understand how photosynthesis works and how the planets orbit each other and how the force of gravity operates. But when it comes to human consciousness, leave that alone. There's no way we can explain that. That's just a total baffling mystery that science cannot approach. No, the scientist wants to have the ability to explain 100% of all facts according to scientific explanations. So anyway, if we can now make it a clear point, nomological danglers are, like, scientists are not a fan of these things. If it's possible to give a scientific explanation or analysis, a scientist would prefer that than to just say, hey, this is something that we can never explain or even come close to explaining. So if consciousness was not the brain, if it was what the dualist says, and it's like this non-physical thinking substance that's got no material basis, then it would remain permanently a nomological dangler because it would not be a physical thing. So you could not observe it, and you could not ever analyze it according to any empirical investigation. So he's now out to show you, the reader, and all of the other readers, that consciousness is not a nomological dangler, that in fact, all of our conscious states are just brain processes, and therefore they are capable of scientific and physical explanation. The field of science that will explain it will be neuroscience and neurology. So anyway, as he sees it, science has made great strides, and it's true, because if you just look at our impressive technology, even the technology that you're using right now to engage in this meeting, science has increasingly been able to explain more and more aspects of the world and universe based on its ultimate physical, chemical constituents and physical laws. So why, according to Mr. Jjc Smart, why should it be that consciousness is somehow left out of our increasingly broad scientific understanding of reality? Okay, so sensations are just brain processes. That's his position. And what he'll do next is he's going to try and consider objections to this claim that a dualist might make. Again, the major claim is that sensations are brain processes. So he's going to try and run through a range of different objections to that claim that dualists may make, reasons that his opponents might say, no, sensations are not brain processes. They're something that's not physical. So he'll take on these objections to his position. And what he's going to try to do is defeat each objection. So he's going to try to rebut them. And after that, he believes, having defeated and rejected the best possible objections to physicalism, the conclusion in the end will be, look, there's no other good objections. I've defeated them all, so physicalism must be true. The dualist's objections have not won. They've not succeeded in disproving his claim. So, okay, that means that as we continue with this meeting, I will walk you through the objections to his position that sensations are brain processes, and then I'll try to state what the replies that he gave were to the different objections. In the book, in the essay, hey there, Brandon, in the essay, there's a total of 8 objections that the author discusses, and he replies to all 8. But as I'm, looking at it to teach, I think that some of them were more essential than others. So I'm not going to go over all 8 of them, but I'm going to talk about maybe the 3 or 4 that were the most important to his discussion, because some of them actually are a little redundant and repetitive. Therefore, I'll just give you the greatest hits from his essay. Okay, so next up, objections to the claim that sensations are brain processes. So what I'll do is I'll write his claim up here so you keep that in mind. This is what is being discussed. Sensations, all states of consciousness, are just equal to brain processes. And now we're going to learn about the opponents of this idea. And as you guys have learned by now in philosophy, there's always objections to any argument. When Anselm gave his ontological argument, we studied 3 objections to it. And now you hear Mr. Smart say that sensations are just brain processes, but let's hear the other side and how people disagree with this. Okay, so objection 1. The first objection to this identity claim is, well, let me put it this way. It's the idea that any ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations, but that same ordinary person has no idea what's going on physically inside of their brain. And so you might say that because I can talk about my sensations, but I have no knowledge of what's going on in my brain, they must not be the same thing. Okay, so here we go. An ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations. But cannot say what is happening in their brain. So, the objection claims, the two things must not be the same, the sensation and the brain process. Okay, so let me explain the objection a little bit before I go through the reply that he states. The objection basically says the following, that any ordinary person can talk about their experiences and their sensations in an ordinary conversation. We do that all the time. That's just what life is. I mean, telling people how things were that you experienced. If I ask you right now, I don't know, did you ever see Black Panther? And you're like, yeah. And I say, okay, well, how was it? What did you think? You'll tell me about your experience. You'll be like, okay, well, I actually thought that it was a little slow in the beginning, but then it really picked up and it had a thrilling conclusion. I liked the character development. So I would say it was a great film. I really liked it. You're telling me about your experience. Or another example, I could say, what do you think of this song? You're like, I don't know. It's really not my taste. It's a little too like pop oriented, and I like stuff that's a little bit darker. You know, so you can tell me about your experiences. Or how was that meal? You're like, oh, it was a little too salty, but it was not bad. You talk about your experiences, you have no trouble doing that, right? But what if I asked you to convert that talk into brain talk? So I asked you, how was the ice cream? Here's what you would not be able to do. Oh, you want to know how the ice cream was? Well, I'll tell you exactly. So as soon as I ate it, you started having like all this activity in the hippocampus. And then over here in the prefrontal lobe, there was all kinds of neural activity in this particular lobe of the brain. So yeah, that's how it was. You can't do that because even if the sensation is a brain process, according to Jjc Smart, you don't know at all what the brain process specifically is. You just know how it feels and how it is to experience the brain process subjectively. So according to some folks, that shows you that they must not be the same thing. If they really were the same thing, the experience and the brain process, then we should be able to switch back and forth between talking about it in brain talk or talking about it in informal conversational talk. So I should be able to describe the feeling of a boring film, or I should be able to tell you what parts of the brain are active at that time, which is identical to the feeling of boredom. Okay, so can you kind of vibe with this objection? The position of Smart is that whatever sensation you're having just is a brain process. But now the critic enters the situation and says, how could that be? Because when I talk about my sensations, I find no difficulty in that. But if a sensation was really a brain process, then how come I can't tell you what's happening in my brain? I can only talk about the sensation, not the brain process. Even if you're like a neuroscientist, there's all kinds of stuff about the brain itself that's not fully understood. So for you to be able to like assign a configuration of the brain to a given mental state is probably not very easy or even possible. So that's why some might say they can't be the same, because I cannot talk about both sides of the identity with the same level of ease and clarity. But remember, Jjc Smart is only telling us about these objections so that he can blow them out of the water and, you know, reject them and refute them. So let's hear what is his reply to this objection. So here's Mr. Jjc Smart's reply, and he says, just because there are two labels or terms or descriptions for something, that does not necessarily mean that they refer to two different things. They can, after all, refer to the same object. So just because there are two different terms or labels for something, sorry, the pen's a little bit faded, so I'll just do a different one. So just because there are two different terms or labels for something does not imply that they refer to two different things. I know it's a little low on the board, so I'm going to type it also. Don't worry about that. Two diff things. Okay. Sometimes I have more room and it doesn't get so scrunched, but in this case I can see it's a little bit scrunched up, so I'm going to put it here. Reply. Okay, so there it says reply. Just because there are two different terms or labels for something does not imply that they must refer to two different things. In other words, you can have two different labels or descriptions of a thing, but they can still refer to one and the same thing. And there's an example that's given here. And so I'll write that in the chat too. Example given, the morning star and, quote, the evening star. So let me explain the example here. So here, this is a real example from history. If you go back in time a little ways, a couple centuries ago, when there was no like electric light, so there was not any light pollution. That meant that even in like big, dense cities, you could see like the full canopy of stars up there in the night sky. And even in the early dawn of the morning, many stars would remain visible in the dim light of the morning. So at that time, people getting up at night and looking at the night sky and examining the stars saw one star that was like the brightest of all in the night sky. And so they gave a term to that star, called it the evening star. So what's the evening star? It's the brightest star visible in the night sky. Now, as I was saying, at this time in history, in the morning, there would still be quite a few stars visible in the early morning sky. And to those early morning risers that get up, you know, crack of dawn, they would be able to look at the morning sky and see a range of stars there. And the brightest one in the morning sky, they gave a different label. They called that the morning star. So far, here's what I've told you. The evening star was the brightest star in the evening sky. The morning star was the term for the brightest star in the morning sky. But some time passed, and more powerful tools to observe the heavenly bodies were developed, and a discovery was made. Now, let me ask any of you clever students, what do you think this discovery was? You know, I think you can probably deduce it just from the remarks here and the setup I've just given you. But what was discovered about the morning and evening star? Surprise, they found out that what? Let me know in the chat. Just give me your best guess about this. Yes, that's right, David. They're actually the same star. Really, the full story is even a little different. It's not even a star. It's the planet Venus, which from the surface of the Earth can appear to be a very bright star in the sky. But anyway, at that time in history, they thought it was a star, and they thought there were two of them. But when they discovered they were the same star, here's the moral of Mr. Smart's reply. Weren't there two different labels? Yes, morning star, evening star. But can we all agree that just because there were the two different labels in language that did not imply that there had to be two different stars. In fact, there was only one, and we just gave it two different terms or two different names. So just because there are two different words or terms for something, it's still possible for them to both refer to the same exact object. In the same way, well, I could refer to your mom as your mom or your dad's wife, supposing they're married. I know that's not everyone's case, but suppose that there's a person who has married parents, that they're biological parents. Now you're referring to your mom with two different terms, the wife of your father or your mother, but it's one person, right? Even if there are different labels. In the same way, I could say Professor Vulic is one of the descriptions of me, but then I'm also a musician and I'm an avid runner. So if you're saying like, oh, runner in the 5K, bib number 72, or Professor Vulic, they sound like different descriptions of a person doing different things, but no matter how many different ways you describe me, I'm just one person. So you don't like multiply me into different objects by talking about Professor Vulic, no musician Vulic, no athlete Vulic. It's just me referred to in slightly different ways. And so the same is true here of the morning and the evening star. Now, how does that relate back to this objection? Well, the objection was saying that I can only really talk in an everyday way about my sensations, but I can't say anything about those brain processes. So are they really the same thing? And now Smart says, yeah, well, there are different roles in language. We talk about sensations from the first-person perspective of the experience. We talk about a brain process from like a third-person perspective of the brain itself and what objective condition that it is in. But even though we have these two different ways of speaking about it, it's really two ways of talking about the same thing. The sensation is the brain process. And so when you call it a sensation versus when you call it a brain process, you're not really referring to two different things any more than when people talk about the morning star and the evening star. They thought they were talking about two different things even, but they weren't. The example of the morning and the evening star was first raised by another German philosopher of the 19th and the early 20th century. His name was Gottlob Frege, and I'm a big fan of Frege's work. Actually, I published one article on him. That was my first published piece in philosophy. And so he's the originator of the morning and evening star example. And he has some funny additional comments about it. He says, suppose there was like a person that stays up super late and they never get up early. So this is a night owl. And they have an unlikely friendship with an early bird. So a person that's up way early and they never stay up late. So night owl and morning man. Suppose these two people have a little conversation and the night guy is like, hey, morning man, when are you going to stay up late with me one of these times? I want you to, because you need to see the evening star. Have you heard about that? And the morning guy's like, nope. I mean, I guess I've maybe heard of it, but I've never seen it because I'm not going to stay up that late. I got to get my sleep. But why don't you get up early with me one of these days, evening man? Because you're missing out on the morning star. Have you ever heard about it? It's beautiful. He's like, yeah, someone told me about it, but I don't think I'm going to be able to get up early enough to see it. So I'll just take your word for it. Now, I'll just stick with the evening star. And so, look, it sounds as if these two people are talking about two different stars and comparing their different experiences of the different stars, but what they don't know is that they're really talking about one and the same thing. So when you talk about your sensations, oh, it was a fun movie or it was a painful injury, it's sort of like you are talking about a brain process, whether you're even aware of that or not. Just like these two individuals having their discussion about the so-called morning and evening star. Does this make some clear sense to you? So I'll read the book a little bit. And now you can see the author say these same things in his own way. His own way of saying it's almost funny. I think the way he presents this objection is like really bold and almost humorous language. So he says here, objection 1. Any illiterate peasant can talk perfectly well about how things look or feel or about his aches and pains, and yet he might not know anything whatsoever about neurophysiology. A man may even think that the brain is an organ for cooling the body, without any impairment of his ability to talk about his sensations. And that means that the things we're talking about when we describe sensations cannot be processes in the brain. And then he hits the critic with this response. He says, well, you might as well say that a nation of lazy people that never saw the morning star or knew of its existence, or who had never thought of the expression morning star, but who did use the expression evening star, could not use the expression to refer to the same star. He also gives another example. He gives the example of lightning and electricity, okay? So lightning is an informal way of talking about something that we know scientifically to be a discharge of ions of water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere. So it's an electrical discharge. But if a person does not know that lightning is electricity, they could also claim the same thing. I don't know what electricity is, but I know I'm looking at a big bolt of lightning in the sky. Obviously, that doesn't mean that it creates two things, lightning and electricity. The lightning just is electricity by a less formal name. And that's what he says here. Consider lightning. Modern physical science tells us that lightning is a certain kind of electrical discharge due to ionization of clouds of water vapor in the atmosphere. This is what the true nature of lightning is. Note that there are not two different things, the flash of lightning and the electrical discharge. There is one thing, a flash of lightning, which can be described scientifically as an electrical discharge. So he says the case is not like the case of a footprint and a burglar, because the burglar is not the footprint. The footprint is a sign of the burglar, but they're obviously two different things. With sensations equaling brain processes, it's rather to say, no, they are exactly the same thing, not one thing that's related to another or one thing that is like a sign of the other, but just the same thing referred to by two different names, as lightning and electricity is too. So then, in short, the reply to objection 1 is that there can be statements of the form A is identical with B, and a person may well know that something is an A without knowing that it is a B. So you may know that something is lightning without knowing that it is electricity. You may know that something is the morning star without knowing that it is also the evening star. An illiterate peasant, I don't know why he uses this term, might well be able to talk about his sensations without knowing about his brain processes, just as he can talk about lightning even though he does not know anything about electricity, but this does not undermine the assertion that it really just physically is either electricity or a brain process. So that's his first objection. And what I want to say about the first objection and reply here is that if you feel like you can follow that back and forth, you know, sensations are brain processes, here someone says, no, they're not for this reason, and that's how he rebuts them. If you understood that point, counterpoint, rebuttal, that's really the core of this essay. So like that's the main lesson of today's meeting that you're supposed to understand, the first objection and reply. There are a few others, and I'm going to talk about them, but many of them kind of revolve around a similar distinction as we see here. So if you understood this one, very good. The remaining ones are kind of similar. Okay, so let's talk about a few other objections to this sensations equals brain processes claim of the physicalist. Thank you. It's just, you know, bound to happen sometimes, but I got a quick reflex, huh? It didn't fall. See, there's a little gap behind the table where if I pushed it all the way flush, it would slide down. But anyway, not to worry. Okay, so next up, objection 2. Objection 2 says this, that the words, at least, the word brain process and sensation have different meanings, and therefore they must not be the same thing. Okay, so let me put that here. So, they must not be the same thing. And his reply to this is much similar to the previous response. He just says that, again, even when words have different meanings, they still can refer to the same thing. So, let me put a more specific statement. 2 words or 2. Okay, so it's totally possible for words to mean different things, but still to have the same reference, to still denote the same object. So I came in first place in like a race within my age division a couple years back in Dana Point, a 5K race. So you could say the winner of the 5K in the 30 to 40 division or whatever of men, or you could say the professor of philosophy 100 at Cal State Fullerton in fall 2021. Now, those words don't mean the same thing. It's like, what's the definition of the winner of the race? It has nothing to do with teaching philosophy. And what is the definition of a professor that teaches philosophy? Nothing to do with somebody who runs a race and wins. But even though those two terms mean different things, they still refer to just me, the one thing. So again, as we see here, yes, it's fair to say that the word sensation, we don't use it in the same sentences as we talk about brain processes. So again, like if you're talking to people about your experiences, you never slip into brain talk. You know, if I asked you, how are finals going? You'll be like, oh, it's very stressful. I've got a lot of work going on. I'm kind of behind in some of these classes, so I'm cramming and I'm losing sleep, but I'm excited about the summer coming up. You could tell me all that sensation talk, but there's no way that you could say to me, oh yeah, well, how it feels right now as I'm going through finals is hippocampus is letting off a whole bunch of neural firings, and then you have in the prefrontal cortex a little bit of dopamine receptors that have become active, and so yeah, that's how I'm feeling. So we really don't have the ability to switch back and forth once again. The words don't even report on the same kind of conversational contexts, but yet again, his response is, that's no obstacle to them having the same reference. We would simply be misled by language if we thought that because we talk about these two things very differently linguistically, that means they must have a physical difference with one another. So it's kind of a common theme throughout his paper that language is the thing which causes us to falsely assume that the mind and your consciousness is different from the brain and your physical neurochemistry. Because certainly there's no role in language for talking about the brain when you have open conversation with people. But just because that's not like normal or expected, it does not mean that it's literally false to say whatever sensation you're experiencing is just a particular state of your brain. So much for the second objection. Right, like again, it would not suit the purposes of daily conversation to make any reference to what's going on in your brain. If somebody asked you whether you liked, you know, a song and you try to talk about your brain, they would probably look at you like you're losing your mind. But just because there's no role that we have in casual conversation for brain talk, that does not necessarily eliminate the concept of it being equal to a state of the brain. Okay, now what's another objection? There's a couple more that we could go over. I'm not reporting on all 8 of them because I thought some were more essential than others to his essay. So we're skipping number 3. Let's talk about objection 4 then. Okay, so objection 4, kind of interesting. It says this. It says that your sensations have no location in space. They have no spatial or physical location. But a brain process clearly does have a physical location. It's in your brain, it's in your skull. So if the sensation has no position or location, but the brain process does, that might be enough for someone to say they're not the same thing. Okay, so let me write that here. Sensations have no spatial, or you could say physical location, but brain processes do. So, according to this objection, they must not be the same thing. Okay, and we'll get to his reply, but let me try and clarify that a little. Okay, so I'm asking you right now to, in your mind's eye, picture an image of, I don't know, what you were doing on New Year's. Okay, got the memory, thinking of it in your mind. Let me ask you, with this memory that you're thinking of, where is it? Where? Can you tell me where it is? Like, is it in the room outside of you? Like, do we see an image projected in the room like a hologram of the memory playing back? No, it's not in space. It's not out there in space. Well, you might say, yeah, the memory's inside of me. But that's also kind of a strange thing to say. Alicia, yeah, that's what I was going into. But think about it, right? Now, I know it's a little, perhaps, what's the word, morbid or something, but suppose that someone was to actually like dissect you. Would they find this memory somewhere inside your body? No, they're just gonna find a bunch of blood and flesh and tissue. You know, so if we went through your head, we'd just see the brain itself and all of the the gray matter in the brain, but we would not see a memory. It's not like I'm gonna dig around in there and that, oop, I found it. Here's like, you know, you know, taking a shot on New Year's Day or at midnight. It's not to be found in physical terms. Like another example, okay? He gives this example himself. So have you ever looked at a light source for just a split second and then, like I've got a couple of light bulbs above me, there's a chandelier right here. And so if I look at that really quick and then close my eyes, for a little while, for a moment, the outline of the light bulb remains burned into my closed field of vision. So you'll kind of see that. You'll see a light source, you close your eyes, and then like a purplish outline of the shape and contour of the light source remains suspended in your darkened field of vision. You can even do this right now. Can you kind of understand? These are called after images. It's just an optical phenomenon. So take the after image as the sensation to be used as an example. If I look at this light bulb, close my eyes, and I see the after image. Where is the after image? Well, once again, it's not out there in the room. And if you were to open and dissect my eyelids and brain and everything, you would not find anything in there that looks like that. So you're tempted to sort of say that these sensations are like, they're just nowhere in space. They're not outside of you. And what's inside of you is not like a little movie being played, but rather a bunch of flesh and blood and bones and tissues. So nonetheless, we have the sensations. At the same time, let's go back into what a brain process is. Now, that does have a physical location, doesn't it? Where is the brain process located? Well, now, for sure, Alicia, it is in your head. Where else could it be? That's where the brain resides. So whatever's happening brain-wise is definitely happening right in there. But the sensation seems like we can't identify or pinpoint its precise location. Well, what does Smart say back against this? His reply here, I think, is pretty blunt and plain spoken. He just says the sensation you have is a brain process. And since it's a brain process, it does have a physical location, even though we don't often say this because it would be a weird thing to say outside of a philosophy or science context. So anyway, the sensation of whatever type is a brain process. So it does have a physical location in the brain. So if our sensations are really located in our head, in our brain, how come we don't usually say that? Once again, the author says it is because it would not suit the purposes of a regular conversation with anybody. If I asked you, tell me your memories of, how, like if I say to you, how was New Year's for you? And you start telling me what it was like and you're going through the memories you have. Wouldn't it be strange if you said, and by the way, let me tell you, these memories that I have, they're right here in my skull, they're in my brain. If you said that, I mean, a person might shrug their shoulders like, sure, I guess, but it would not be a regular thing to say. It would sort of be off to the side of the point of the conversation, because outside of philosophy, where we're wondering what is the nature of consciousness, we don't usually ask, well, where is it originated and where's the physical location of it? So if I say to you, oh, I'm in pain, my knee is hurting, I twisted it. By the way, the pain is actually, I mean, it's in my knee, but I'm experiencing it as a cognitive state of the brain. We usually wouldn't talk in those ways, but it's not actually literally wrong to say those things. If you say that, you know, your experience of the delightful taste of the ice cream is in the brain, or if you say that your memory is in the brain, it's not wrong to say that. It's just that it's something that we don't usually have any reason to say because nobody asks us, where is it though, by the way? Where is your memory at? It's an odd question. It was an odd sounding answer, but he's saying despite the oddity of giving such questions or reporting such answers, according to physicalism, we should expect that that's actually true. Since you have sensations and they are brain processes, they're in the brain, even though we don't usually think about ourselves as a system in which a memory or thought is located in that brain. Okay, so much for objection 4. Now, there's like 2 more in the paper that I guess I wanted to talk about. Next one, let me jump to objection 6. So objection 6 is this. Sensations and stuff are private. They cannot be publicly observed. But brain processes can, at least in principle. If we look at like a brain scan, we could see what centers of the brain are active and where the neurological activity is happening while you have a given experience. So one might argue they must be different because my sensations and experiences, no one can examine them but me. But my brain process could be looked at on a graph or on a chart. So how could those 2 things be the same when one is private and the other could be looked at by others? Okay, so sensations cannot be publicly observed, but brain processes can. So they must not be the same, according to this critic. Okay. All right, so like, if I ask you to think back in your mind right now about your New Year's, probably this New Year's wasn't the most fun, right? Because most of us are on lockdown, probably hanging out at home, but that's still fun in its own way. Anyway, I digress. Go back in your memory to that New Year's Eve of 2020 leading to 2021. Now, as you're thinking about that memory, can I see it? Can I just like look at you and be like, oh yeah, I see what you were doing because I can see like the projected image of your memories? No, that memory's in your head. It's locked away in your own psychology. So unless and until you report to me what it was like, I'll never really be able to gain access to it. You understand? Or if you're eating ice cream, you know, you're tasting it, not me. And I can't tap into your experience of the flavor. I mean, I could eat it for myself, but then I would be having a different parallel experience to yours, not the same exact one as yours. So in a way, if you think about sensations, they're kind of private. If I'm right now thinking of something, like I'm thinking of my mother's face right now, like for real I am. And you don't know what her face looks like. But as I think of her mind in my mind's eye right now, I'm seeing it very clearly. But you can't see that, and vice versa. Whatever you were doing on New Year's as you're thinking about it, I have no ability to picture it because it's not my memory, it's yours. So therefore, sensations are kind of locked away in the privacy of your own mind. No one else can gain access to them. Even if people have similar experiences to you, that's a different numerically distinct experience than the one you had. So sensations can't be viewed by others, but a brain process could be, okay? So if I put you into a brain scanning device and I said to you, think of your mother's face, then I could look at the brain scan while you're doing that and I could see what parts of the brain are active. So look, I can look at the brain scan, but I can't look at your actual memory. So doesn't that mean that they're not the same thing? Seems like it might. But once again, his reply is much similar to the others. The reply is just that this is just a linguistic difference. It is just language that makes it so that it's not appropriate to talk about sensations in the same way that we talk about brain processes. But again, this is a linguistic difference, not necessarily a physical difference of 2 different things. So Okay, so reply, what I wrote is this. Again, this is a difference in the language we use to talk about sensations versus brain processes. It is not a real physical difference. So when we talk about the sensation as an experience that we are having, we employ the subjective language of a first person's perspective on it. When we talk about the sensation as a brain process, we employ the third person language of an observer of the same brain process. But just because the first personal description, which is in the language of an experience, and the third personal description, which is in the language of like an objective physical process, just because they sound different does not mean that they necessarily refer to two different things. So talking about your experience from the subjective point of view of how it felt and what it was like is to just talk about the brain process in a different linguistic format. To talk about the brain process scientifically as a physical state of the brain is just to apply a more scientific description of the thing that we informally talk about as what it was like and how it felt. So again, he thinks that language kind of is misleading in a way. With language, we invent different roles of language. We talk about the brain when we talk about it in a physical, objective sense, and we talk about experiences and sensations when we just talk about what we're going through and how it felt to us. But just because language offers us a multiplicity of ways to refer to this process, that does not mean that it has to actually be two distinct and different things, like the sensation is happening without the brain or vice versa. Okay? And then, as always, guys, I try to be clear and thorough and detailed, but if anything I'm saying is not coming through or you'd like further explanation or elaboration, always feel free to jump in at any time. But I take it then that this is making some degree of sense. Let me know if not, and I always appreciate your feedback. But one last objection then, okay? We're going to talk about the last, well, there's two more. There's 7 and 8, but I'm just going to cap it at number 7 because I think that's the last one that's really easy enough to describe, and I think it's a good ending point for this essay. So, what's objection 7? Okay, so 7th objection. This one is kind of like, I think of it, or I call it like Descartes' objection, because it's the objection which says, we can clearly imagine the mind and the body existing separately. One thing I just want to say, I don't know if you guys hear this noise pollution. There's just some work crews outside that are replacing some gutters right outside of my house, and that's why there's a little noise in the background. I'm trying to talk over it. Sorry for that. I can't do much about it, but anyway. The 7th objection is kind of like the Cartesian objection, because as I was saying, it's the one which claims that because you can clearly imagine your mind existing with no body or even brain at all, since you can clearly imagine those two things existing separately, they really must be two different things. Okay, so the objection says this: I can't imagine myself having sensations, states of consciousness, in other words, thoughts, memories, feelings, perceptions. I can imagine myself having sensations even if I had no body or brain. So sensations must not be brain processes, according to this objection. Okay, and we'll hear his reply. But let me first reinforce and give more summary to that. As you guys learned with Descartes, right, with the method of doubt, he says, maybe you're dreaming your whole body. Maybe the body that you think you have is just an illusion, and you're just a mind with no body attached, thinking all these things while you're having these illusions and dreams. So if it's a possibility to contemplate the existence of your mind having thoughts with no body at all, and like how you can also, I guess, imagine yourself existing in the afterlife after your body has been annihilated back on planet Earth, since we can clearly imagine these two things existing separately, as Descartes has argued, they must not be the same thing. Because look, if your sensations could exist with no brain at all, then obviously sensations would not be brain processes, because if they were, you would need a brain for the sensations to exist. So if you can imagine the sensations minus the brain, then that means that they must not be the same. So how's he going to reply to this one? Well, I actually think he has a pretty good response. He says this, going back to the earlier objection, objection 1. He says, well, you know what? People could also imagine that the morning star is not the evening star. In fact, we can go further than that. Not only could people imagine that, but people really did think that for a long time until it was discovered that they were the same object. So people can also imagine that the morning star is not the evening star, but guess what? They are the same thing. So just being able to imagine two things being different, Smart is saying that that does not necessarily imply that they really are. So he's rejecting this conceivability argument of Descartes. Let me write this here. I can also imagine that the morning star is not the evening star, but it is. Okay. Let me read a little bit from the book, and you'll hear the same discussion. So objection 7 says, I can imagine myself turned to stone and still having images, aches, pains, and so on. Like, I can imagine myself having these thoughts and ideas if there was no brain whatsoever. And he says then, following the reply, I can imagine that electricity is not lightning. I can imagine that lightning is purely an optical phenomenon. I can imagine that lightning is not electricity. I can imagine that the evening star is not the morning star, but it is. So it's not necessarily a clear window into whether two things are different, that they can simply be imagined as different things. You can imagine that whoever won the Dana Point 5K in the 30 to 40 division in 2018 was not the professor of philosophy. You can imagine that that's two different people, but it's the same person, even if that's a concept you could imagine, imaginary thought, right? So last word he gives is this. The way he looks at this objection is that the person making it seems to think that consciousness could exist with no body whatsoever, and that means that you basically think consciousness is like a ghost, that something that could have consciousness could exist with no material basis at all. And so he says that's kind of like the ghost theory of consciousness, if you really think about it. That's like saying that when the body's gone, a ghost will continue, or that at least it's possible to imagine the separation of the two things, the thoughts and consciousness and the body that stays behind. But he says that's like a ghost theory of consciousness, because what it's saying, again, is that consciousness doesn't need the body. So what would it be? It would be something with no physical structure at all. And what he says then is this. If you want to hold the ghost theory of consciousness in a way that cannot be absolutely disproven, because if ghosts did exist, then of course no physical observation could be conducted that could prove or disprove it. So he says, in a way, I have to say that it's a possible theory, but whenever you have a theory or a hypothesis, you have to consider it in the light of alternatives. And what he says then is, if you want to hold this ghost theory of consciousness, compare that to the brain theory of consciousness, which is what physicalism offers. And what Mr. Jjc Smart thinks is that the ghost theory of consciousness in comparison to the brain theory is way less plausible, and it's got way less evidential support. So in the end, he kind of says to you, take your choice. You've got options here. You can go with the ghost theory of consciousness or the brain theory, but to be honest, the brain theory has way more rational and empirical evidence to support it. I mean, think about it, right? When people take drugs, for example, and they introduce certain chemicals to the brain, it affects their consciousness, right? It results in altered states of consciousness. So if the brain was not just a physical thing subject to chemical and physical forces, then why should it be responsive to the introduction of chemicals, etc., to it, which then result in alteration of consciousness? Another case I could give you. How about brain injury or trauma? If a person suffers a significant head injury, that can affect and impair their consciousness going forward for the rest of their life. But if the brain was not necessarily the source of consciousness, then why should that be? Shouldn't we expect that your consciousness would be unaffected by whatever physical happenings are going on with respect to it, if it's not necessarily rooted in the physical brain? So I mean, for different reasons that we could go on and on about, there seems to be a lot of reasonable support for the idea that consciousness has something to do with the brain. And so his last word is that to anybody who says that the ghost theory is the more plausible, he just denies that and says that the brain theory is more reasonable. So I'll read that, and then that'll kind of be maybe the last word on Jjc Smart. He says, I suspect that the objector is thinking of experience as a ghostly entity. So, on his view, consciousness is composed of ghost stuff, and on mine, it is composed of brain stuff. Perhaps the counter reply will be, let me go down a little further. So he says the dualist cannot really say that an experience is composed of nothing, because he holds that experiences are something over and above material processes. So he thinks they are a sort of ghost stuff. I say this hypothesis at least makes sense, but I do think that experiences are not to be identified with ghost stuff, but with physical brain stuff. Now, this is another hypothesis, and in my view, it's very plausible, and it cannot be rejected a priori, meaning prior to all experience. So in the end, he's kind of like saying, you can take your own decisions here, but do understand that the main alternatives on offer are to think of consciousness as something like a ghostly substance with no physical form, or to think of consciousness as essentially rooted in the brain. And he's given all these arguments as to why there's no compelling arguments that a dualism is true. So he concludes with his identity thesis. Sensations just are brain processes. Having reviewed the heaviest objections against this, he thinks he's satisfactorily dismissed all of them. And so that leaves us with, he believes, a reasonable conclusion that physicalism is true, because the objections to it from dualism do not serve to defeat the argument or to credibly pose an alternative to it. So anyway, that's everything from Mr. Jjc Smart. And I guess we can wrap up with that, because we only have like 6 minutes left, and the next author takes a little time to go over. But let me at least tell you a few things about the next author, so that we have that in mind when we come back after the weekend. So there's only one more piece on philosophy of mind, and that means that we're almost all the way on schedule, but I'll probably have to delete one of the essays from the next unit to make room. But the last author on this is this guy, Alan Turing. And Alan Turing lived from 1912 to 1954. And in 1950, he wrote the paper that we're going to study, which is called Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. Alan Turing is an interesting person. He's actually, I think, he's a very, very important human being that should probably be more well known to just everyday people, because he's the inventor, the creator of the digital computer. And I mean, how revolutionary is the computer as a device? We're using them every day, all the time, even right now. So when you think of the major impact that computing systems have had on human beings just in the last, 70 years, we can't overstate the importance of his contribution. And he was also a code breaker for the Allies when we were fighting against the Nazis and the Axis powers in World War II. So he's a British citizen who, working with the Allied powers, he did play a key role in decoding these cryptographed messages that the Nazis were sending to their military, and therefore disrupting their plans. So because of his skill in like early computer programming languages, he was able to decode these cryptographed messages, and that played a big role in helping us defeat Nazi Germany. So he had a major impact on the world, both in facilitating the defeat of Nazism and fascism in World War II, and also creating the digital computer. There was a movie made about his life a few years back, which I think did bring him a little bit more into pop culture consciousness. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about it, but it's called The Imitation Game, and Benedict Cumberbatch won the Oscar for Best Actor for depicting Alan Turing in the movie. So maybe some of you have seen that. That film doesn't really go much into his work in computing and computer science it focuses more on his work as a code breaker for the British. But anyway, another interesting biographical fact about him is that he was gay, and at that time in history, this was considered a big taboo, and it was even considered criminal in Britain at the time. There were laws that existed then that if a person was identified as like openly gay, they could be prosecuted under certain like perversion laws, and he was. So someone turned him in, and he had to go to trial, and the court imposed on him a sentence that he had to take like a cocktail of chemicals. They call this chemical castration sometimes, and that was supposed to like destroy his libido and his sex drive. So anyway, he died pretty young. You can see he was only 42. The official cause of death, well, not suicide, I meant to say cyanide poisoning. So he ingested a bunch of cyanide, and some people think it was foul play. I believe it was officially ruled a suicide, but anyway, he's left behind a big legacy, the legacy of computing. And anyway, this paper that he wrote in 1950 is very interesting because he as the digital computer, he as the inventor of the digital computer, speaks with, I believe, a certain degree of authority and kind of visionary insight. His position in the paper is simply this, that someday computers, machines will have consciousness, that they will be thinking things like us. So he believes in some, possible future that we will eventually get to. There will be machines that think and have consciousness. So if that's true, imagine that. You guys right now, we're living with computers, but imagine that by the time you're all much older and your grandparents and you have grandkids, that they are actually making friends with computers, because computers are now thought of as having consciousness. So like, you're, hey, what's up? You want to chill? And you're talking to a computer, and you guys are like actually having friendships. Is that a possibility? Well, some people don't think so, but Alan Turing, the creator of the computer, did think it was possible. So he writes in this paper about that. He gives his full-on analysis of what it would take for machines to have consciousness, and he lays out the criteria that he thinks they will eventually surpass. But along the way, he also discusses a bunch of objections from people who say, no way, machines will never have consciousness, no matter how well they imitate human behavior. So I don't know what you think about that, but there's certainly been a lot of interesting science fiction in the last 100 years about this, whether it's Space Odyssey 2001 and the HAL 9000, or like Will Smith was in the movie I, Robot, or Ex Machina, and on and on and on. It's a common trope or theme in a lot of science fiction to have intelligent AI that takes on some type of consciousness. Of course, in many of the movies, it turns to evil and like wants to destroy us or something, like in Terminator. But at any rate, that's the question that we're going to focus on Monday by looking at Alan Turing's article from 1950. Could machines have consciousness? I don't know. Have any of you ever seen the movie Her? That's another kind of interesting one in that genre, where Joaquin Phoenix full-on falls in love with a machine, a robot, and the question is like, is this a real relationship with a thinking thing, or is it just a computer program? Yeah, it's a fun and interesting topic. But this is the last piece. I wanted to at least set up for you who the author is, what the title is, what the topic is, and then we'll continue with this on Monday and finish it up, hopefully not too long. So then I guess that's about it for today. Make sure that we're all good. Let me know that you're good to go. David, if you choose to do essay topic 1, do you need to mention Turing? Well, let me say this. You don't need to mention Turing for essay topic 1. For essay topic 1, at a minimum, you would have to have Descartes and Stoljar. And then I leave it to you to determine how much and what you would like to use from the other authors. I don't think it's a bad thing to make reference to Turing, but the paper's not due until the following Monday. So you would still have plenty of time, I think, to collect your thoughts. But look, long story short, it's not absolutely essential to write a successful paper on topic 1 to include reference to Turing. I think just having Smart, Stoljar, and Descartes is fine. But if you do want to have anything extra from him put in the paper, you can always edit it in later or just omit it. But that's part of the reason why I delayed the due date by 5 days, so that you'd have more time to consider that if you want. So I hope that answers your question. But to all of you guys, including, thank you, Alicia, and thank you, David. I just want to make sure that we're good to go. It kind of feels like hanging up on somebody if I don't see those goodbyes before I hit end the stream. So are we all right then? Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good weekend. And if you need anything, email me anytime and I'll be available. If you're working on your drafts too and you want any comments, I'll be happy to look at those as long as they don't come in too late. So for now, have a good one and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.